The session had already been running for 3 hours when I noticed the chair. Not because something broke the rhythm of the chamber, not because a voice cut off, or a signal flickered, or someone turned their head. The reason I noticed was the opposite of all of those things. It was the absence of a signal, the silence where something should have been, the specific quality of wrong that a room produces when something that is always in it is no longer there, and everything else continues as if it is. Seat 7. Third row from the central podium, right side of the chamber, set at the slight forward angle the human delegation had requested 15 years ago, so the occupant could maintain a direct sight line to the speaker floor, without having to lean out of the seat back. The human seat. Empty. Not unfilled the way seats go unfilled when delegates run late. Not absent the way a seat is absent when someone steps out to take a call. Empty in the particular way a space is empty after the thing that always occupies it has been removed. The nameplate was in place. The communication panel on the armrest was installed and present. The delegation marker at the base of the row was correct. Everything about the space said, "Someone sits here." Everything about the space was wrong. I am Velkara, Senior Archivist of the Galactic Council. I have attended 412 full sessions in 2 centuries of continuous service, and in those sessions I have seen every variation of what delegates do when they are supposed to be somewhere, and have found, in the preceding hours, reasons not to arrive there precisely on schedule. I have seen the representative of a major trading collective deliver a formal statement while still consuming something that affected the respiratory comfort of every species within 3 rows, and show no awareness that this required acknowledgement. I have seen a senior Drenathi analyst slip into genuine sleep during a 7-hour infrastructure arbitration concerning drainage allocation in the Kellen Belt, and have to be woken with a stylus by his aide. And I filed the corrected session transcript without comment, because an archivist does not comment on what happens, only record it correctly. I have never, across 412 sessions and 2 centuries, seen a human seat empty, without someone from their embassy compound sending a message within 40 minutes, explaining the absence, providing an estimated arrival time, and then typically a second message revising the estimate, and sometimes a third, acknowledging that the second had also been optimistic. I told myself it was nothing. The session was occupied with a trade boundary reclassification dispute between the Velthani Collective and the Solon Compact over commercial access rights along a corridor neither party had meaningfully used in 11 years, meaning the dispute was primarily about historical grievance, and the corridor itself was approximately decorative. Soth Varen, the Velthani senior envoy, had been at the podium for 90 minutes, using the measured, architecturally elaborate rhetorical style of his people, the kind of language that turns minutes into geological time, through the sustained weight of subordinate clauses that never quite resolve before generating another. I had 3 active archive logs open on my desk panel. I was doing what I always do in long sessions where the content is secondary to the procedure, keeping the stylus moving and distributing my attention between the floor and the 4 other things that required it. I looked at the chair again. Still empty. Their attaché, a young woman named Perrin, who I knew by her worn red satchel with the fraying left strap, and by her invariable habit of arriving 11 minutes before session start, and using those 11 minutes to organize her materials with the deliberate calm of someone who found order genuinely useful rather than performative, was not in her secondary seat. The aide who normally filled the position 2 rows behind her, a young man I knew only by the seat he occupied because good aides become part of the furniture in the best possible sense, was also absent. The human communications terminal in the left alcove of their delegation space, a flat-screen unit they had requested permission to install 15 years ago, following a memo they circulated describing the Council's standard interface as, in their precise language, roughly 40 years behind anything they would classify as operationally adequate, a memo I had archived with something approaching private appreciation for its directness, was dark. Not the warm amber of standby, not sleeping, waiting to be woken. Dark, the kind of dark that comes after a deliberate decision about a power switch. There is a difference between a terminal that is resting and a terminal that has been turned off. One is a pause, the other is a choice about whether to be available. I wrote in my session log, human delegation absent, cause undetermined, flagged for inquiry. The session continued. Soth Varen's measured voice filled the chamber with the cadence of someone who understood that persuasion at this level operated on a timeline longer than any individual argument. Two of the Dranathi delegates had begun a side conversation at a volume carefully calibrated to remain below the audio pickup threshold, which was technically within protocol and practically irritating to everyone seated adjacent to them. The Orith observer from the upper gallery maintained all three of its optical inputs in the slow rotating scan pattern that signaled active high-fidelity recording rather than passive attendance. The Solon compact representative wore the controlled expression of someone counting the minutes remaining before they could stand at the podium and methodically address every factual mischaracterization that had accumulated in the past 90 minutes. The chamber around me was proceeding exactly as chambers proceed, with the specific blend of formality and tedium that means nothing is wrong and everything is slow, and the business of governing is being done. Seat 7 sat in the middle of all of it, like a word omitted from a sentence. Not any word. The kind of word whose absence changes what the sentence means. The session closed at the 14th hour. I filed the standard archive record. I tagged the absence for welfare inquiry follow-up and cross-referenced the protocol governing unannounced delegation absences. Then I walked back to my quarters on the residential ring, sat at my desk, and sent a standard welfare check ping to the Human Embassy compound on Station Meridian 9. The ping went through clean. Carrier confirmed. Signal received by the relay. Delivered, in the technical sense that the transmission reached its destination address successfully, not in the sense that anyone on the other side of the address was there to receive it as a message rather than a signal. No answer. I assumed equipment failure on their end. Sent a second ping with a standard priority flag, a third, a fourth with an elevated priority designation that would, under normal circumstances, route the message directly to whatever duty officer was on shift regardless of concurrent tasks. All four delivered cleanly by relay. None answered. No maintenance auto-notification. No delay response. No standard confirmation, which every registered delegation was required by protocol to maintain in their primary channel, stating simply that the message had been received by embassy personnel. Nothing. I went to bed and lay in the dark of my quarters and thought about the terminal. Humans are structured around communication in a way that is, viewed from the professional distance of someone who has spent 2 centuries cataloging them without direct daily involvement, genuinely remarkable as a species-level trait. They are unreliable with deadlines in a manner that reflects genuine prioritization of the immediate over the scheduled, rather than indifference to scheduling itself. They fill shared spaces with conversation and motion, and the occasional physical collision that happens when a species built for rapid acceleration moves at a speed that does not always account for what is in the immediate path. They produce olfactory situations with their food. They are loud in corridors. They ask the question that was not on the agenda. They follow up before the initial message has been addressed. But they are never silent. Every species that passes through the council chamber long enough develops a signature, something the other species come to know about them, not from reading files, but from being in the same room when they are being themselves. The Velthani's signature is patience deployed as a form of structural pressure. The Dranathi's is documentation used as a kind of comprehensive armor. The Orith's is a reserve that most other species experience as coldness, and that is actually the most efficient possible management of a very finite attention. The human signature is communication that does not stop because the formal session has moved to the next item. They argue in the back channels while the floor vote is being logged. They send messages at hours that make no sense in any other species' time system. A Dranathi cultural observer, in a report filed in my archive 130 years ago, described them as communicatively relentless, in a manner that appears structural rather than volitional, meaning not that they are trying to communicate constantly, but that the possibility of not communicating does not appear to register as an available state. I had not thought about that phrase in decades. I thought about it now, in the dark, with the image of the dark terminal sitting in the middle of my thoughts like a fact that had not yet found anywhere comfortable to settle. I wrote in my private log, "Humans are unreliable but never silent. They always have something to say. Always." I looked at that sentence for a while. Then I thought about what it meant when the thing that was always true was no longer true. On day 2, I sent a formal inquiry message and a direct request to the duty communications officer at the embassy. Both delivered. Neither answered. On day 3, I filed 2 formal welfare inquiry notices with the Council Communications Registry, which placed the matter in the official record, at a level that required some form of response within the standard administrative interval. I received 2 back-channel notes from other archivists in the building, both asking quietly whether I had any information. I had none. The channels were quiet after that, which told me everyone else also had none. The part that stayed with me was this: nobody said anything in session. I understood why, technically. An unannounced absence by one delegation, however unusual, does not obligate a floor statement. The procedural rules do not require it. But the human delegation was not the kind of absence that goes unnoticed, the way a quiet delegation's absence goes unnoticed. They were one of the most consistently active presences in Chamber 3. A silence from them extending past one session without any communication of any kind should have generated something from the floor. A query, a procedural note, a request for information. Nothing came. And nobody asked why nothing came. I began to think about the nature of silence and what it tells you about everyone who is keeping it. On day 11, I sent my 12th ping. Delivered. Unanswered. On day 17, I pulled the human delegation's full communication record from the past 22 months and mapped it by week, healthy and consistent for 18 months. Then, starting approximately 16 weeks before the missed session, a taper. Gradual and consistent, and invisible in any individual week, and undeniable across the whole curve. Still responding to required administrative contacts, still filing required reports. Just less, in every direction, with a consistency that had a direction to it. Not malfunction, reduction. They had been reducing for 16 weeks before the chair went empty. On day 23, the Velthani Security Division filed a transit order I found in the traffic logs while processing unrelated routing data. 3 survey drones to Sol system perimeter, inbound and outbound within the same operational cycle. The drones came back intact. Human space was not dark. Border beacons running on current schedule. Infrastructure active. Navigational corridors posting correct data. The beacons operating in human code and in 17 galactic languages, because the humans had always learned other species' languages, with the consistency of a species that found it genuinely offensive to assume the universe would adapt to their tongue. They were home. They were not answering. A younger colleague named Drath came to the archive on day 31 with a cascade relay failure theory and a reference to a human cultural communication reduction period he had found in a personal database. He had done research. He was proud of it. I looked at him. He waited. I said nothing. What I was thinking was this: humans build redundant communication systems into everything they design because communication failure causes them something close to physical distress. They maintain backup channels for their backup channels. When cultural traditions require reduced external communication, they file advance notification with the relevant parties and include emergency contact protocols. No such notification had been filed with the Council Communications Registry at any point in the preceding 6 months. He left mildly dissatisfied. On day 47, I pulled the voting record. Every formal council session for the past 112 years. Every human delegation proposal, motion, vote, recorded outcome. I cleared my desk and I read it all. 6 hours. The pattern established itself in the first 40 minutes and documented every variation of itself for the remaining 5.5. Human proposals were not rejected. They were redirected, received warmly at the podium, thanked for their contribution to collective understanding, referred to the relevant subcommittee for further review, and reviewed at whatever pace made the proposal procedurally obsolete before a decision was formally required. Not killed. Placed somewhere that looked like progress, until enough time passed that the question was no longer current. In session 309, a delegate named Owen Barry, compact and precise, with the bearing of someone who had learned several languages before most species reach professional age and found the experience permanently useful, submitted a security coordination proposal for the Keth Trade Corridor. Piracy losses had increased 400% over 18 months. His proposal documented the losses in thorough detail, outlined a resource-sharing framework between 5 species with specific operational timelines, and included a 70-page appendix of traffic and incident data, the kind of proposal that has answered the objections before they are raised, received warmly, referred to the security subcommittee. The subcommittee met twice and then underwent restructuring. The proposal disappeared between the old committee's dissolution and the new one's formation, never formally rejected, simply no longer anywhere. 3 months later, A human private contractor fleet began quietly running the Keth corridor. No formal agreement, no council authorization, no record of acknowledgement from anybody. They showed up. The corridor was safe. Nobody asked why. In session 341, a delegate named Kara Hollis submitted a revised pathogen containment protocol for outer ring stations. She was responding to a recent outbreak managed barely, and only because a human medical team had arrived at the affected station uninvited and addressed a situation the council's official team had not been equipped for under current guidelines. Her argument: the protocols were 40 years behind current biology for the network's current size. The gap was measurable. The consequences were already visible. Received warmly. Referred to the Medical Standards Subcommittee. The subcommittee scheduled its first review meeting 14 months out. The meeting was rescheduled twice and absorbed into a broader restructuring process. Session 401. Owen Barry stood at the podium. "Third time in my reading," he said. "The human delegation wishes to formally note that a significant and growing gap exists between the Council's documented record of galactic infrastructure maintenance and the actual operational state of that infrastructure. Human entities are currently providing support across more than 40 distinct functions that are not reflected in any formal Council authorization. This is not raised as a grievance. It is raised because the gap represents a planning risk. If Council decisions are based on a record that does not reflect operational reality, those decisions will produce outcomes the record did not predict. We are asking for the record to reflect what is actually true." He was thanked for his contribution. The session moved to the next item. I had been in that chamber, my stylus in my hand. I had logged his remarks and checked them against the session transcript and filed the corrected version to the archive. I had not said anything. I wrote in my official inquiry report, "Nature of human withdrawal, undetermined. Ongoing monitoring recommended." My private log said 2 words. They left. Not missing. Not malfunctioning. Not observing a cultural period. Left. There is a weight of difference between those things, and the direction of that weight points toward a decision. Decisions do not happen to people. People make them. And when I held the voting record against the communication taper, against the dark terminal, against the 47 unanswered pings, the shape they made together was not a malfunction. It was a conclusion someone had been working toward for a long time. I looked at those 2 words for a long time. Then I went back to work. I submitted a request to join the working group monitoring the human delegation situation. My stated reason was archival expertise relevant to the inquiry. I did not state the actual reason, which was that I had been reading the voting record for 1 day, and I already knew that the standard inquiry process was not going to produce the answer I was looking for, because the standard inquiry process was looking for a cause, and the cause was not in any of the standard places. I spent the next 3 months building what I eventually understood to be an accounting. I started calling it a supplemental inquiry document, which is the kind of language that lets you go looking for things without generating procedural questions about your methodology. But by the time the document had grown past its 4th revision, I knew what it actually was. An accounting. The itemized record of what had been given and what had not been acknowledged. What the gap between those 2 things looked like when you stopped treating it as background noise and wrote it down in a numbered list that you could read from beginning to end without looking away. The first item was the Keth corridor. 62 years of continuous route coverage by a human private contractor company called Carver Web Transit. They had appeared in the corridor approximately 3 months after the Council's own security patrol coverage dropped below functional levels, following 2 consecutive budget restructurings that had moved assigned vessels to higher priority routes. No formal agreement had been filed. No council body had issued an authorization, or a letter of engagement, or any document that established a relationship between Carver Web Transit and the infrastructure they were providing. They had not submitted a competitive bid. They had not been selected through any procurement process. They had simply appeared on the route, and the route had become safe, and the council's routing manifests had continued showing the corridor as a council jurisdiction route, without noting that the corridor's safety was being produced by a company that had no formal relationship with the jurisdiction that claimed it. 62 years. Then the humans went quiet. Carver Web Transit filed no cessation notice with the council authority. They did not submit an end-of-contract report, because there had never been a contract. They stopped running the route. Within 11 weeks, 3 cargo transports had been stripped, and one had simply not reported in. I added it to the accounting. The second item was already developing before I finished documenting the first. RETH-7 Station, mid-size outer ring, 40,000 permanent residents across 9 species, Class 4 pathogen containment event. Council medical response deployed within 36 hours. Professional team, complete equipment load, all applicable current certifications maintained. They followed current containment protocol correctly and completely. Current protocol had been written before Kara Hollis's proposal in session 341. The Medical Standards Subcommittee review that would have incorporated her revision into official guidelines had been rescheduled twice and then absorbed into a broader administrative restructuring review. The subcommittee had never formally rejected the proposal. The proposal was simply in a queue that had not moved in 41 years. The pathogen on RETH-7 had a mutation rate that the current protocol had not modeled for. The medical team was skilled. They improvised under conditions the protocol had not prepared them for. They worked for 9 days. By the time containment was complete, 19,000 residents had required active treatment. 4,000 had permanent respiratory complications, a number that stopped being a number the third time I read it. I added RETH-7. The third item came from a footnote in a supplemental border status document, filed as an administrative update, and not the kind of document that typically received close reading. I was reading everything closely by then. The Vethnari Dominion and the Solon Compact had been in dispute over 3 contested systems for 93 years. Not war, never war in that period, but a sustained grinding standoff that had twice approached open conflict and then retreated. The Council's formal mediation process had been deployed twice. Both times, the dispute had been tabled for further deliberation. The footnote said, in one sentence, that back-channel negotiations had been conducted continuously through a private mediation firm for 44 years. I traced the firm's registration code. Human, registered out of Port Anchor Station. Current status, inactive. As of 8 months ago. I sat with this for a long time. Not council mediation. Not any formal process. Not anything in the official record of the dispute. A private human mediation firm working back channels for 44 years. Doing an informal, unacknowledged practice, what the council's formal process had deployed twice and not accomplished. Keeping the temperature between 2 heavily armed dominions below the point at which conflict became more appealing than patience. 44 years of that work, none of it in any official archive, none of it attributed to anyone in any document that the council would have reviewed. Inactive. The Vethnari Dominion had mobilized 2 fleet groups 3 months ago. The Solon Compact had moved defensive assets to contested system boundaries 2 months ago. The council's formal mediation process had completed its preliminary briefing documents. I added it. The fourth item was a water filtration facility in the outer Drenathi cluster. The facility had been operating on a maintenance protocol designed by a human technical working group 31 years ago. The biannual core recalibration procedure built into the protocol required guidance that had, for 31 years, been provided quietly by human technical contractors under an informal arrangement with the facility's operators. The arrangement had never been formalized with the council's infrastructure registry. The facility's current maintenance staff had not been informed that the protocol had a component that required external expertise to execute correctly. Carver Web Transit did not run the Keth corridor anymore. The human technical contractors had not visited the facility in 8 months. The biannual recalibration was 6 weeks overdue. I added it. The fifth item was a translation database. 14 council communication systems depended on it for cross-species signal interpretation, across 47 language pairs, and 11 specialized technical vocabularies. The database had been maintained continuously for 22 years by a human linguistics team, working under an informal arrangement with the council's communication infrastructure division, an arrangement that had never been converted to a formal service contract. The database had not been updated in 8 months. In the past 2 months, 3 interpretation errors had been logged. Minor ones. Correctable. The kind of errors that would remain minor until the network reached a scale where they were not. I added it. I kept working. The accounting grew. By the time I reached item 30, the pattern had stopped being a pattern in the sense of something you notice and had become something more like a grammar. The underlying structure of a language you did not know you were reading until you had read enough of it to recognize it. The structure was this: a gap in council coverage, produced either by budget decisions or administrative delay, or the simple institutional tendency to defer what was not urgent, followed by a human entity, governmental or private or informal, sometimes a firm registered out of a station whose name I had never heard before I started looking, filling the gap without announcement, without formal authorization, without any document that established the relationship between the gap and the filling of it, and then the human entity becoming inactive, and the gap becoming visible. Item 31 was a trade route negotiation framework that had produced the language appearing in 3 separate bilateral agreements between non-human species. The agreements attributed their negotiated terms to the parties themselves. The language had been drafted by a human working group operating for 11 years without attribution in any of the documents they produced language for. The working group was now inactive. The bilateral agreements it had produced the language for continued to function on the terms it had created. Nobody reviewing those agreements knew that the terms had an author. Item 32 was a medical supply routing arrangement for 6 outer ring stations that had been running for 20 years through a human logistics coordinator who had built it informally out of a series of favor trades with local freight operators. The arrangement had never been filed with the Council Infrastructure Registry. The logistics coordinator had retired 7 months ago. Nobody had known the arrangement existed until it stopped functioning. I stopped at item 40. Not because I had run out of items, because item 40 was the last formal human proposal submitted to the council before the silence started, and reading it broke through the professional distance I had been maintaining, the way a thin thing breaks when enough weight is finally put on it. The proposal was a comprehensive joint information sharing framework, cross-species medical databases, unified containment protocols, coordinated resource response systems, integrated communication standards across the existing network, hundreds of pages of careful work, the kind of work that takes years to compile, not weeks or months, the kind of document you produce when you are not trying to persuade anyone of anything, because you have moved past the point where persuasion is the goal, the kind of document you write when you are trying to leave behind something that could fill the space you are about to make, if anyone chooses to use it. Submitted 6 weeks before the silence started. Filed correctly with the relevant subcommittee, no review date scheduled, no assignment to a reviewer, simply in the queue, in the same queue where proposals went to age past their usefulness, while the world they were designed to address moved forward without them. I looked at that document for a long time. Then I stood up from my desk and walked to the window, and stood there with my hands flat against the observation panel, and felt the faint vibration of the ring's rotation move through the glass into my palms. Outside, a transit vessel moved along one of the outer routes, lights steady, course correct, carrying its manifest cargo to its manifest destination. The station went about its business. The stars held still, in the way stars hold still when you are moving too slowly to perceive the movement. I sat down on the floor, between 2 rows of archive shelves, on the floor of my own archive, for no particular dramatic reason and with no particular audience. My body decided that standing required a confidence about what was beneath me that I did not currently have, and sitting was the more honest position. I thought about 40 items, each one individually explicable. A budget restructuring here, an overloaded subcommittee there, a routine administrative deferral of something that was not quite urgent enough yet. Each one a reasonable decision within its own context. None of them connected in the official record to any of the others. All of them connected. Owen Barry at the podium. We are carrying more of this than the record reflects. He had been thanked for his contribution. I had been in that room. My stylus had been in my hand. I had heard what he said, and I had filed what he said, and I had moved on with the rest of the chamber. What would it have cost to stand up, to say, I am the archivist. I maintain the record of what this council does and does not do. And I want to look at the gap this delegate is describing, not because it is assigned to me, but because if there is a significant difference between what the record shows and what is actually happening, then the record is not accurate, and an inaccurate record is a failure of my function, and I will not maintain a failure. Let me pull the data. Let me show the chamber what the gap looks like in numbers. Let me make the invisible visible, before the invisible becomes the reason something goes wrong, that we did not see coming. I had not said that. I had filed the remarks and moved on. I got up from the floor. I went back to my desk. I opened the accounting and kept working. By the time I had 47 items, I submitted a request to join the formal diplomatic delegation to Sol System. My stated reason was that archival expertise might be relevant to documentation of the contact. The actual reason had several components that I was not going to put in a formal request. The delegation was approved with 5 members: Soth Varan, the Velthani Senior Envoy, 2 Council Secretariat representatives, a Drenathi diplomatic observer, and me. The transit was 11 days. I spent most of it reading human cultural history, not the diplomatic archive, which I had read enough of, the other kind of history, literature that thought its function was to tell you what happened in language that gave you the weight of what happened, rather than just the facts. Journalism in the old tradition, philosophical writing on obligation and acknowledgement, and what you owe the people around you, and what happens to a relationship when the accounting runs unbalanced for long enough without being named. On day 9, I found a labor history document from 300 years ago. A group of workers who had performed essential functions for 4 decades while their employers categorized those functions as supplemental. The employers had genuinely believed this categorization, even as downstream failures occurred with predictable regularity whenever the workers' output dipped for any reason. The employers attributed the failures to coincidence, to seasonal variation, to factors they could explain without touching the categorization. Then the workers stopped entirely. The failures did not stop. They were no longer explainable by other factors. The document called what came next going to ground. Not striking, not demanding, not issuing ultimatums, withdrawing entirely, and quietly, and without announcement, and waiting for reality to accomplish what argument had failed to accomplish. Then, after an interval, building something new, not returning to their previous employers. Building something of their own. I put the document down. I thought about it for the remaining 2 days of the transit. The beacon activated as we came out of transit at Sol System's edge. Automated. Professional. Running in 17 galactic languages the way the humans always ran their automated systems. In every language of everyone who might reasonably arrive, because they had decided at some point that assuming the universe would adapt to your language was the one arrogance not worth practicing. You are recognized. State your purpose. Soth Varan stated our purpose, with the warmth and authority that 20 years of diplomatic experience produces. Formal council delegation. Urgent matter. Request for direct contact. 11 seconds of silence. Proceed to waypoint Helios. Do not deviate. The human cutter that met us at the waypoint was mid-size and built the way human vessels are built, efficiently, as if everything that did not serve a function had been removed before it could become comfortable or familiar. It came alongside without ceremony, and without the small ritualized gestures that most species deploy when receiving a diplomatic contact, to signal that the contact is welcomed. The woman who opened the channel was young, late 20s in human terms, brown hair, a calm face. The specific flat professional affect of someone who has been very thoroughly briefed and is managing the distance between that briefing and her own response to it with deliberate skill. She said, "The consul will receive your delegation. You have 2 hours. Not, welcome. Not, we are glad you came. Not, we have been hoping for this contact. 2 hours. Said the way you say 2 hours, to people whose extended grace period closed somewhere they were not present for, and whose arrival now is noted rather than celebrated." She gave us docking coordinates and ended the channel without additional language. The docking bay was clean and functional, and reached by blue directional markers that were correct and efficient, and never once suggested we were guests rather than visitors with an appointment. No escort came. A directional panel at the entrance told us to follow the blue markers to Reception Hall 4. The corridors were maintained at the standard that human facilities maintained, which was very high, and were empty of the small social signals, the decorative objects, the visual welcoming cues that most species deploy in spaces designated to receive diplomatic contacts. We followed the markers. Reception Hall 4 was a neutral room in the specific way that neutrality is itself a position. Not cold. The humans understood that cold communicates something, and they were not making that statement. Not warm either. A table of appropriate dimensions for 6 occupants. Chairs scaled for the species we were. A carafe of water with 6 glasses. A document display. A recording device. Claire Watts. I had been trying not to build expectations, because expectations are the architecture you bring to a room, and reality is what you find inside the room, and the distance between them is where things go wrong. But I had been building the accounting for 3 months. I had read the voting record. I had sat on the floor of my archive with the weight of 47 items, and understood what they added up to. I had been bracing for something in that room. Anger, maybe. Or the specific cold satisfaction of someone who holds every position and is enjoying the precise geometry of the moment when the other person understands that. Claire Watts was neither. She was organized. She sat at the table with her hands folded in front of her and completely still. Not the stillness of suppression, not the stillness of someone controlling something that wants to move. The stillness of someone who has already moved through everything that needed to be moved through and is now simply present in the room where the final step is being taken. She looked like someone at the far end of a preparation that had taken a very long time. She looked like someone for whom this meeting held no surprises, not because she was managing her reactions, but because there was nothing left in it to surprise her. Soth Varan introduced the delegation. 5 members, roles, the formal standing of the contact. He introduced me as Senior Archivist, a title that in most formal diplomatic settings produces a brief acknowledgement of institutional weight. Claire Watts nodded at me with the specific quality of someone who has already read my file and found in it exactly what she expected to find. She did not speak until Soth Varan completed the formal statement. Then she reached forward and activated the document display. 460 pages opened to the table of contents. She gave us time to read it. She did not speak while we read. The table of contents was 3 pages, section headings, subsection breakdowns, date ranges attached to each category. I read every line of it because every line was relevant, and because I needed a moment inside the reading to understand what I was looking at before I had to be present in the room with the person who had assembled it. It was the accounting, not mine. Theirs, complete and detailed and organized with the precision of something that has been in preparation for years, not for months, not since the silence started, for years. Every gap in the 47 items I had found, and more beyond them, all sourced and dated and cross-referenced. Every proposal submitted and tabled, every informal service provided and unacknowledged, every back-channel arrangement that the official record did not contain, all of it, in order, with dates. This document had not been compiled after the silence started. This document had been in preparation while Owen Barry was still attending sessions and filing proposals, and standing at the podium saying the words that would later appear as items in their own document. This offer was made on this date, and received warmly, and referred to this subcommittee, and is now no longer anywhere. Soth Varan asked, with measured warmth, what the human delegation was seeking from this contact. Claire Watts looked at him. 4 seconds of silence. Maybe 5. A unit of time that did not have a name in the standard vocabulary of diplomatic pauses. She said, "We are not seeking anything." She said, "We wanted you to understand what you had." The room held that. Soth Varan spoke. He was skilled, genuinely, substantively skilled. Every sentence carried the right weight, the right combination of acknowledgement and openness. He spoke about shared interests and the value of the coordinated governance the Council had provided across 3 centuries, about the mutual investment in stability that bound every species in the framework together, about the losses that came from fractures in a system built over a very long time. He meant it. Every word was sincere. She waited until he was finished. She said, "We are not coming back to the Council." A pause. She said, "We are building something else. Nothing further." She let it sit in the space between them, in the space between the document on the display and the recording device, and the untouched water glasses, and the chairs occupied by 5 council representatives who had traveled 11 days for this meeting. And she looked at Soth Varan with the patience of someone who has said everything that needed to be said, and is waiting for the room to finish arriving at the place it was always going. Soth Varan asked what the human government intended by that phrase. He asked whether further dialogue was possible. He asked, carefully, whether the 2-hour window could be extended given the significance of the issues involved. Claire Watts checked the time on her panel. She said, "The 2 hours ends in 14 minutes. We can schedule a follow-up contact through the standard beacon channel if your delegation has additional items for the record. The standard beacon channel, the automated one, the one that received transmissions and routed them to whoever was on duty. The channel the border beacon used. I watched Sothvaran understand what she meant by that. It was brief, a small thing that moved through his expression, and was contained before it settled. Then he thanked her for the meeting, and requested that the delegation be permitted to review the full document before any follow-up contact. She said, "The document has been transmitted to the Council Secretariat Archive. Your archivist can retrieve it." She looked at me when she said that. I looked back at her. We understood each other with the clarity of two people who have been reading the same document from different sides of the same table for a long time, and have both arrived at the same place in it. The meeting ended at 13 minutes and 40 seconds. She stood when we stood, shook Sothvaran's hand with a firmness that was neither hostile nor warm, simply present. The woman with the brown hair appeared at the door and walked us back through the blue marker corridors to the docking bay with the same efficient neutrality she had shown on arrival. On the return transit, Sothvaran organized a working session on day 3 and asked for assessments. The Secretariat representatives were thorough and balanced. The Dranathi observer gave careful structural analysis. Sothvaran offered 3 interpretations, his preferred being that this was a sophisticated negotiating posture that could be engaged with through the right combination of acknowledgement and incentive. He asked me. I said, "They are not bluffing." He asked how I reached that. I said, "The document. The table of contents alone took years to compile. That level of organization, that sourcing depth, that date range, you build that after the decision, not while you are considering it. They knew how this meeting would end before we arrived. It was a notification, not a negotiation." He said, "With respect, all parties prepare documentation for significant diplomatic contacts." I said, "Not documentation of what they have already stopped doing. You write that document after the decision is made, not before. The document is not a negotiating tool. The document is a record. It is meant to show, after the fact, what was offered and when, and what happened to the offer. It is for the archive." He said, "I appreciate the perspective." The session moved on. I went back to my bunk and lay in the dark and thought about Claire Watts's hands on the table, completely still, not controlled. At rest, the way hands are at rest when everything that needed to be done is done, and what remains is only one more conversation. I thought about what building something else meant if you were human, and you had spent 300 years in a council that received your proposals warmly and sent them to subcommittees and moved on. You would not go back to the table where the pattern was established. You would build a different table, with the species who had also been in the back of the room, also thanked, also moved past, with the gaps filled by design, with the lessons of the accounting built into the foundation of whatever came next. And you would build it before you left, so that when you walked out of the room it was already standing. I thought about that for the remaining days of the transit, and did not change my assessment. We docked at Station Meridian 9 on a Tuesday. I filed the preliminary contact report, retrieved the 460 pages from the Secretariat Archive, spent 2 days reading from the first page to the last, not because I was missing anything, but because I needed to hold the full weight of it before what happened next. What happened next was a Thursday. New registry codes in the commercial routing network. Not announced, not declared, no notification to the council of any kind. New route designations with species identifiers I recognized from Chamber 3. The small ones, the ones in the back rows, the ones the sight lines from the central podium were slightly less direct toward, the ones whose delegation nameplates I knew, because I had been reading the chamber for 2 centuries, but whose voices I would have had difficulty placing in my memory, because those voices had rarely been the ones the session was organized around. I counted the species in the initial routing manifests. 41. I checked every one. Every single species in the manifests was a species whose council proposals I could trace in the archive, species whose warnings had been tabled, species whose formal submissions had gone to subcommittees and were no longer anywhere, species who had, at various sessions across various decades, stood at the podium in Chamber 3 and said something true and been thanked for their contribution, and passed. The Compact of Free Margins Charter was filed in the council system the same day the manifests appeared, filed correctly. through every required protocol, because whatever they were building it by the rules. Every rule, applied to an outcome the rules had not anticipated. The charter was 40 pages: trade coordination, mutual defense, dispute resolution, medical resource sharing, communication infrastructure, route protection. Every gap in the accounting, every single one, named specifically, addressed in detail, with implementation timelines and contingency provisions, and the specific careful language of something written by people who had spent years thinking about exactly what language would hold. This had not been written since the silence started. This had been in preparation while Owen Barry was still filing proposals that were going to subcommittees, while the accounting was building itself, while the quiet taper was in progress, and nobody in the chamber had yet noticed the direction of it. He had known at the podium in session 401 that the proposal would go to subcommittee. He had filed it anyway, because the filing created a record of the offer, because when the document was on the table in Reception Hall 4, the record would show precisely what had been tried and precisely what had happened to it. The offer to formalize, the offer to make the informal visible and plan for it correctly, the offer received warmly and referred for review. The review date never scheduled. I closed the official archive log. The council convened an emergency session the following Friday. Soth Varen's presentation was comprehensive and measured in the way that his presentations always were, which is to say that it was very good and did not change anything about the situation it was describing. He outlined the formation of the Compact of Free Margins, its membership, its stated framework, the implications for council jurisdiction, and galactic coordination. He presented 3 analytical frameworks for understanding what had happened, each one more generous to the council's position than the one before it, and he concluded with a set of recommended responses that ranged from formal diplomatic outreach to the exploration of a hybrid governance model that might accommodate both structures. He had done the work. The presentation was thorough and carefully structured, and built on solid procedural precedent. He had done everything that the situation could be said to require of someone in his role. The Velthani Security Division raised formal concerns about destabilization. The Dranathi Observer submitted a formal inquiry, requesting clarification of the Compact's legal standing relative to existing council jurisdiction frameworks. Several senior delegates gave speeches. The speeches were about galactic unity and the precedent set by unilateral departure from the council framework, and the risks that parallel governance structures pose to a stability built across 3 centuries of coordinated effort. They were sincere speeches. Some of them were right, in the way that something can be technically correct about its own framework, while being entirely wrong about that framework's relationship to what exists outside it. The human seat was empty. The nameplate was still mounted. The communication panel on the armrest was still installed. The chair was in its position at the slight forward angle the delegation had requested 15 years ago to maintain a direct sightline to the speaker floor. Nobody at the podium mentioned it. The council moved to response measures on Saturday. A formal censure of the Compact of Free Margins was drafted and brought to vote. The Velthani proposed a trade restriction mechanism. The Dranathi submitted language for a formal declaration that the Compact's governance claims were not recognized under existing council agreements. These processes moved, I noted, considerably faster than most council processes moved, which told me something specific about the relationship between urgency and the direction in which it flows. The council was very good at responding to things that were visible and formal. It had been considerably less good at responding to things that were quiet and structural. The Compact of Free Margins did not respond to the censure, did not respond to the trade restriction proposal, did not issue a counter-statement, a request for reconsideration, a position paper, or any of the formal responses that a body in the council's framework would normally issue when faced with a formal declaration of non-recognition. On Sunday morning, one message arrived through the standard communication channel, plain text, no header, no formatting, no ceremonial language of any kind. 11 words in Galactic Standard, filed and received and time-stamped and delivered. The offer to negotiate was extended 300 years ago. It expired. The channel went quiet after that and stayed quiet. I read those 11 words more times than I would have expected to read 11 words. I read them until they stopped being words in the sense of units of language and became instead something with the specific gravity of a statement that was always going to be made and has now been made and the air is permanently different on the other side of it. Then I closed the official archive log. I had maintained that log without interruption for 200 years. Every session, every motion, every vote, every statement from the floor, every formal document submitted to the record, every amendment and procedural note and administrative update. The record was complete. The record had always been complete. Every session of the Galactic Council in my term of service was documented accurately, fully, and accessibly. The record was not the same thing as what the record was about. I opened a blank document. This is what I wrote, starting from the beginning, for the record, that no one had asked me to keep, and that I needed to exist, regardless of whether anyone ever read it. I wrote about the chair, and what it meant when the thing that was always in it was no longer there, about the dark terminal, and the distinction between a terminal that is resting and a terminal that has been turned off, about the 47 days of unanswered pings, each one delivered correctly and received by the relay and answered by nothing on the other side, about the communication record and the taper that started 16 weeks before the session and had a direction to it that only became visible when you mapped the whole curve. I wrote about the voting record and the 6 hours of reading and the pattern that established itself in the first 40 minutes and documented its variations for the rest. I wrote about Owen Barry, who I had seen at the podium in session 309 and again in session 371 and again in session 401, and what it meant that a person returned for a second and then a third term after watching what happened to the work they brought to the first. I wrote about the specific quality of patience required to do that, the kind of patience that is not optimism and is not stubbornness and is something else, a decision to remain present in a system you know is not going to change until the moment you choose to leave it, because remaining and documenting is its own kind of preparation for what comes after. I wrote about Kara Hollis and her proposal in session 341 and the Medical Standards Subcommittee and the 41 years and RETH 7 and the 4,000 permanent respiratory complications that were the distance between a tabled review and an implemented protocol. I wrote about the accounting and its 47 items. I tried to write about each one the way it deserved to be written, not as an administrative notation, not as a data point in an analysis, but as a thing that had weight and a shape and consequences that were being carried by specific people who had not asked to carry them. The 19,000 residents of RETH 7 who had required active treatment, the passengers on the stripped cargo transports in the Keth corridor, the 40,000 residents of the two dominions that had been 11 months from open conflict when the port anchor mediation firm kept them from crossing that line, and who were now 3 months into a mobilization that the Council's formal process had not yet fully briefed itself on. I wrote about item 40, the proposal submitted 6 weeks before the silence, hundreds of pages of careful work written by people who already knew how the story ended, and were trying to leave behind something that could fill the space if anyone chose to use it. The unscheduled review date, the queue that had not moved in 41 years. I wrote about the transit to Seoul system and the labor history document on day 9, and the word the document used for what the workers did before they built something new. Going to ground. I wrote about Reception Hall 4 and Claire Watts and her still hands, and the 460 pages that had taken years to compile, and the 11 words she had said, and the 14 minutes she had said them in. I wrote about what it meant to understand, in that room, that you were not in a negotiation, that the meeting was a notification, that the decision had been made somewhere else, at a different table, a long time before this room and this conversation. I wrote about the compact of free margins and the 41 species in the first routing manifests, and what it meant that every one of them was a species I could trace in the Council archive from the same angle, from the proposals tabled, the warnings filed, the sessions attended by delegates who had stood at the podium in Chamber 3 and said something true and been thanked and moved past. They had not left alone. They had built the table they wished had existed before they left, with everyone else who had been waiting for a table that was not coming. I wrote all of this carefully and at length, not because it was assigned to me, not because anyone had requested it, not because it would go into any formal system or be reviewed by any body, or affect any decision being made in the emergency sessions that were continuing in Chamber 3 while I wrote. I wrote it because I am an archivist. An archivist makes records. That is the function. That is the thing that 200 years of this work had made me. A person whose most fundamental response to a thing that matters is to write it down carefully and make sure the writing is accurate and make sure it is preserved. The record I was maintaining officially was accurate. Every session logged, every motion recorded, every vote filed. The formal archive of the Galactic Council was in excellent order. But the formal archive had not noticed the chair for 47 days. The formal archive had received Owen Barry's remarks in session 401 and filed them correctly, and moved on. The formal archive had catalogued 411 species worth of proposals and votes and outcomes without ever producing a document that said, the gap between what this record shows and what is operationally true is large enough to walk through. The formal archive had done its job correctly and completely, and had never once sat down on the floor between two rows of shelves and asked what the job was for. I was writing that document now. It was not going into the formal archive. It did not have a category in the formal archive. It was going into a file on this terminal, in this office, maintained by this archivist who had spent 200 years doing her job correctly and had needed to sit on the floor of her own building before she understood the gap between correct and true. The council sessions continued. I attended them, filed the records, logged the motions and votes and formal statements from the floor. The censure passed. The trade restriction mechanism advanced to final review. The Dranathi Declaration of Non-Recognition was accepted into the formal record. The Compact of Free Margins was noted in the archive as a parallel governance structure not recognized under existing council agreements. The Compact of Free Margins continued operating. New agreements in the routing manifests every week. Medical resource sharing frameworks between member species that looked, when I read the specific language, like the proposal Kara Hollis had submitted in session 341, revised and updated and implemented in the system that had not needed a subcommittee to make it current. Communication infrastructure agreements that referenced, in their technical appendices, the translation standards the human linguistics team had maintained for 22 years, route protection frameworks for the Keth corridor, and 12 other routes that had appeared in my accounting as gaps. The compact was not building from zero. It was building from the accounting. It was building from the specific, itemized knowledge of what had been needed and not provided, what had been offered and not accepted, what had been maintained informally for decades and finally stopped being maintained, and what needed to exist now that the informal maintenance was over. They had known what to build because they had spent 300 years identifying exactly what was missing. In Chamber 3, the sessions continued. I filed the records. The records were accurate. The calendar moved forward. The business of governing 411 species continued in the framework that had governed them for 3 centuries. Outside the framework, 41 species were building something new, and the 11 words were in the archive, time-stamped and accessible, and they would remain in the archive as long as the archive existed. The offer to negotiate was extended 300 years ago. It expired. I had put them in the record. My job was to put things in the record correctly. I had done it. What it meant was something the record could not hold. That was what I was writing in the other document. I finished writing on a Thursday night. The station's lights had cycled down to their late hours setting, the dim, warm register that meant the operational day was over, and the building was running on its night cycle staff. The archive was quiet in the specific way archives go quiet when the people who work in them have gone home, and the only sound left is the faint ambient hum of the storage systems and the distant vibration of the station's rotation coming through the floor. I had been writing for 3 days. Not continuously. I had attended 2 sessions, filed the records, eaten when I remembered to, slept when my body insisted. But in the hours around those things, I had been writing. I had written more words in 3 days than I typically wrote in a formal session year. Not because formal archive work is sparse, but because formal archive work uses the minimum language required to be accurate. The document I was writing for myself used more language than that. It was trying to do something different than accuracy alone. It was trying to hold the weight of what had happened, in addition to the record of what had happened, which are 2 different projects. I read it back from the beginning, which I do not usually do with documents I have written, because rereading your own work reveals the distance between what you meant and what you said, and that distance is uncomfortable in proportion to how much the document matters. This one mattered more than anything I had written in 200 years. I changed 3 words, removed one sentence that was trying too hard to explain something that did not need to be explained, left everything else. Then I wrote the last part. This is what I wrote. I wrote, the accounting is 47 items. Each item is individually explicable. Each item has a budget decision, or an administrative delay, or an overloaded subcommittee, or a routine deferral as its immediate cause. Each item is a reasonable decision within its own context, made by people working within a system doing what systems do, which is preserve their current configuration while processing the things that enter them. None of the items are individual. They are all the same thing. A gap forms. A human entity fills it. The filling is not acknowledged. No contract is written. No formal relationship is established. The gap and the filling of it are not the same thing in the official record. The official record shows the gap. The official record does not show the filling, and the distance between those two versions of the same space is where 3 centuries of unacknowledged debt accumulated. And then the humans stopped filling the gaps, and the gaps showed what they had always been. I wrote, we mistook silence for consent. They did not complain loudly or constantly. They submitted proposals and attended sessions, and stood at the podium and said what was true in clear and specific language, and then, when the language was not sufficient, they kept working anyway. We heard the continued working, and we understood it as agreement, as satisfaction with the current arrangement, as confirmation that the arrangement was sustainable. It was not agreement. It was patience with a limit we did not know about because we had never asked what the limit was. I wrote, we mistook patience for permanence. The humans showed up for 300 years. 300 years is a very long time, long enough to build the assumption that it would continue into the future by the force of having continued in the past, which is not how patience works, and is not how decisions work, but is very much how institutions work. Institutions tend to mistake the thing that has always been true for the thing that will always be true. The distinction between those two things is what the distinction between history and prediction is supposed to capture, and we had let the distinction blur, and the blurring had cost us the ability to see what we were depending on, until the depending had nothing to rest on anymore. I wrote, we mistook the ones who never made us beg for the ones who never needed to be asked. The humans never made the council beg. They never issued ultimatums or threatened withdrawal, or used their informal structural role as leverage in formal negotiations. They ran the Keth corridor for 62 years, and they kept the Vethnari and the Solon Compact from crossing a line for 44 years, and they maintained the translation database for 22 years, and they sent Owen Barry to the podium to say, we are carrying more of this than the record reflects, and the absence of an ultimatum in that statement was something we experienced as absence of urgency. It was not absence of urgency. It was the specific generosity of people who have decided not to use what they are owed as a weapon. We experienced the absence of the weapon as absence of the debt. The debt was there the whole time. I wrote, the humans were not the foundation of the galaxy. They were the reason the cracks did not spread. There is a difference between those two things, and the difference is the most important thing in the accounting. A foundation is what you build on. You know it is there. You planned for it. You engineered the structure above it to rest on it correctly. A foundation that is removed causes a collapse that was always predictable. The reason the cracks do not spread is different. It is not what you built on. It is what you did not know was there, holding the places where the building was less sound than the plans assumed. It is invisible by the nature of its function. If you can see it working, it means something has already gone wrong. You only see it when it stops, when the cracks that were held start moving again, when the stability you were experiencing turns out to have been a managed instability that someone was managing for you without your knowledge. That is what the accounting is. It is not a list of things the humans did. It is a list of places where the stability was managed and the management was invisible, and then it stopped. The Keth corridor is crack spreading. Reth 7 is crack spreading. The Vethnari mobilization is crack spreading. The translation database errors are crack spreading. Item by item, across 47 items, the accounting is a document about what the stability was made of and where it has started to fail now that the making of it has stopped. The Council is responding to the compact of free margins as if the compact is the problem. The censure and the trade restriction mechanism and the declaration of non-recognition are all aimed at a parallel governance structure that developed outside the Council framework. The compact is not the problem. The compact is what the humans built out of the accounting. It is the thing that fills the gaps by design, rather than by informal goodwill. It is the structure that names what it does, and authorizes what it does, and requires formal acknowledgement of what it does. It is the governance framework that 41 species will have in common in 50 years, and in 100, and in 200, and whether the Galactic Council is still processing the censure documents it filed this week will depend on a great many things I cannot predict. But I do not think whether the compact has standing under existing council agreements will be among the relevant factors. I wrote, I know the difference between the foundation and the reason the cracks do not spread now. I wrote, I knew it 47 days into an empty chair. I knew it when I read the voting record and found the pattern that the pattern had been there for 112 years to establish. I knew it when I mapped the communication taper and saw 16 weeks of someone gradually reducing their presence in a system they had already decided to leave. I knew it when I built the accounting and watched 47 gaps open in the places where informal filling had stopped. I knew it when I sat in Reception Hall 4 and watched Claire Watts fold her hands on the table and understood that the still quality of those hands was the still quality of someone who had already moved through everything that needed to be moved through. I knew it, and I had known it. And what I had done with the knowing was continue to file the records correctly, and attend the sessions, and keep my stylus moving, and maintain the professional distance that the role required. And the role required it. And the professional distance is not wrong. And the record is accurate, and accurate and true are not the same thing. I said nothing. In session 401, and in all the sessions that preceded it, and in the 47-day silence while the chair sat empty, and in all the days of the accounting, I attended, and I filed, and I maintained the record, and I was in the room when Owen Barry said, "We are carrying more of this than the record reflects." I was in the room, and I had my stylus in my hand, and I said nothing. I could have. Not in the way of intervening in the session, not in the way of standing up and making a statement from the archive station, but after, in the corridor. I could have found Owen Barry in the corridor after session 401 and said, "What you said today, I want to look at it. I want to pull the data and see the gap. I want to know if the record is accurate, or if the record is only correct. I want the archive to reflect operational reality, rather than institutional assumption. That is my function, and I would like to perform it." I had not done that. That is also in the record. I am putting it there myself. I am putting it there because an archivist's function is to make the record accurate, and the record is not accurate if the record does not contain the archivist's own failures of attention. The record of what the council did not see is not complete without the record of what I did not see, looking at the same thing from 10 feet away for 200 years. I saved the file. Outside the archive window, the station's outer ring continued its slow rotation in the dark. A transit vessel moved along one of the outer routes, lights running steady in the standard configuration, course nominal, carrying its manifest cargo to its listed destination. The galaxy was visible beyond the station's structural elements. Not stars exactly, at this proximity, more like the context stars provide, the scale that makes the station feel correctly small. I thought about the 41 species in the first routing manifests. I thought about what they would build over the next decade, and the decade after that. The medical infrastructure, and the route protection, and the communication standards, and the diplomatic frameworks, all named and contracted and formally acknowledged, all built by people who had spent years in the back of Chamber 3 being thanked and moved past, and who had finally found a room where the chair was for them, and the agenda was theirs, and the proposals went somewhere other than a queue that did not move. I thought about the Keth corridor, and whether Carver Webb Transit's records were in the Compact's data exchange, whether the 62 years of route data they had produced had ended up in the framework that was now building formal route protection for the same corridor, whether the work had survived the withdrawal in a form the next structure could use. I hoped it had. I thought about what I had not known about hope until the accounting showed me its inverse. In Chamber 3, the session was still running. I could check the feed from my terminal if I wanted to. I did not. I knew what was on the agenda, and I knew how each item would proceed, and I would attend tomorrow, and file the record, and maintain the archive that held the council's history, because that was my role, and I was good at my role, and I would continue to be good at my role. The record would be accurate. The record being accurate was not nothing. The record being accurate was the thing that made the document I had just written possible. The document that used the accurate record to show what the accurate record had missed, which required the accurate record to exist. You cannot show the gap between the record and the truth without a record to show the gap in. The record is the ground the truth stands on, even when the truth is that the record is not enough. I had spent 200 years building the ground. I knew what the ground was for now. The compact of free margins was operating. The accounting was filed, in the only place it was going to be filed, in a document on a terminal, in an archive on Station Meridian 9. The 11 words were in the official record, time-stamped and preserved. The Galactic Council was meeting. The human seat was empty. The nameplate was still there. It was going to stay that way. By the 12 tides. I think some part of me always knew it would. Some part of me knew it in the space between the dark terminal and the first unanswered ping. Some part of me knew it in the voting record and in the specific quality of Owen Barry's voice in session 401 saying, "We are carrying more of this than the record reflects," in the tone of someone who has already measured the weight and knows where the weight is going. I knew it. I said nothing. That is in the record now. The record is complete. The record being complete is not the same thing as the record being sufficient. I know the difference. That is also in the record. That is the last thing I am filing.